Yeah, I remember
and when he's in the morgue, here's all these bodies with white sheets over them, and he couldn't figure out which was his body. Well, in his case, one of his hands had been lower than the sheet, and it had his class ring on it. And he recognized that class ring, and he said, "Oh, that's my body." So that's the body he reanimated. And then the body began to wiggle and jerk and squiggle and, all this kind of stuff. And in order, you'll love this, the morgue door was open, and in order, they happened to be walking by the hallway, and he noticed that one of the corpses was wiggling. And he screamed, and he went for help, and of course, here come all the doctors on the run, and George is coming back to life.
And that had to have been way over 20 minutes. By the time you're at the morgue, you've been there.
I don't
been
know.
Hours.
I can't be sure, but anyway, we've got lots of cases like that. And the case of George Rodenaya, dead and supposedly in a freezer vault in a morgue in Tbilisi, Georgia. It was 3 days. 3 days. And they brought him out to do an autopsy because it was a highly political a case. And they were cutting him up on the autopsy table. The tea cut, and they had done the bottom part or the bar of the tea, and then they were going. The stem then of the tea was right up the trunk of the body toward the chin, and so they'd done the lower part. They were going up the chest, and his eyes opened. Well, that's not normal. I mean, that's not abnormal. So they simply shut his eyes, kept cutting, and his eyes opened again, and they didn't think anything of it. They shut his eyes and kept cutting, and his eyes opened a third time, and the head of autopsy screamed, fell backward, and took a 1-month leave of absence. And we have the case of George Rodenaya, and one of his uncles was on the autopsy team. George himself was a physician.
Wow.
And his case is phenomenal. Right, of course, that we have no way to know, certainly, what the temperature was in the freezer vault in Tbilisi, Georgia. But he certainly was there 3 days, and they brought him out, and he seemed still dead. As near as they could tell, he was dead. The body looked dead. Certainly there was no fluids left on the guy. They're doing the cut. I mean, they're cutting the guy up. And then he revives.
So I think after all of these years, what you've learned is that we know a lot more about who we are than we did, but what we also are learning is that everything we've been taught about who we are and what the body is and what consciousness is.
Well, it's all subject to question.
Yeah.
It's all now subject to question. It's not what our texts tell us. What we consistently find, what the medical community must and is facing, is that when nothing is functioning, the body's flatlined, the body is dead, you can still have out-of-body experiences, clear, enhanced consciousness, self-identity with emotions, cognition, thought perception, full use of the faculties, and intact memories.
That's what I'm saying is so mind-blowing. This is so mind-blowing that we have so much evidence for this now. I know you said that the doctors are getting it now. And
they're starting to open up to it.
Yeah, I think it's at the beginnings, don't you? Most doctors are still very much in the clinical mindset, don't you think?
Well, a lot of them are, but even in that clinical mindset, in all the books that I write, well, certainly in the last 2 books I've written, I have places for the medical and cautions and what to look for when you're treating someone who might have been a near-death experience, or especially a child. I think that's really critical with children because of the difference in the physiological changes afterward. But we certainly uh, they're having to face it, and some areas more than others. I had a child experiencer about 2 years ago, grown now, had a really critical case of lupus, was rushed to Johns Hopkins Hospital up there in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins. This was an emergency case, rushed in. The doctor there was curious. He said, "Have you had to have a near-death experience?" And she said, "Yes." And of course, she was 7 at the time. It was a drowning. He said, "Tell me about it." So she told him about it, and immediately, this guy switched all of her medications to the mildest pharmaceutical he could give her, and a child's dose. In other words, the mildest dose of the mildest medicine he could give her, and overnight she was well and went home. No problem.
That's an unusual case, don't you think?
Well, it's unusual in that here's an emergency physician who knew about near-death experiences, but more importantly, knew about the after effects. Because when you come back, you lose your tolerance of pharmaceuticals. And so that's a big one for the medical community, especially with kids, when they are medicated according to age and weight. Well, hey, if they've had a near-death experience, whoa, you got to go less than that. So, all kinds of cautions in my books. But we're trying to reach the medical community. We're more and more successful than we used to be. And, I'm hoping that my books, everybody else's books, all of this information gets out there. IANDS, IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. We just call them by their initials, IANDS, IANDS. They have a website, www.iands.com, where they give classes, lessons, CEU credit, material that nurses and doctors can take to educate themselves, to become more fluent in how to handle a person who might be having a near-death experience under their care, and how to handle them afterward, even years afterward, even decades afterward, because most of these changes are lifelong. So, we're really trying to reach the medical community in a big way.
You also said in your book that medical staff often see spirits. What do you mean
they
by
do
that?
Too.
What does that mean, and how did you get them to talk to you?
Hey, my dear, how did I get anybody to talk to me?
You're Columbo.
Yeah,
You're Columbo.
So.
But
I'm a cop's kid. I was raised in a police station. I know how to do it. But yeah. What was wonderful? What was it? I think it was 2007 or maybe 2005, a few years ago anyway, in Dallas, Texas, the home of the big, huge medical community. Is like a city unto itself. And at the MD Anderson Cancer Center, we held one of our, we meaning IANDS, held one of their annual conferences, and at this one, hundreds of people were there. Most of them were medical people. Please understand that. Most of them were medical people, and open mic. And doctor after doctor got up and cried. Absolutely crying, because finally at last they could talk without censure, without fear of losing their job. And they were talking about what they could hear during surgery, what they could see during surgery, beings on the other side. They were directed. They could see what's going on in the body as if they had X-ray vision.